we've heard all of the testimony in the trial of Tom Robinson. And if you're familiar with, any legal show that exists in the universe, you know that closing arguments come last. So closing arguments is the time when both the prosecution, so Mr. Gilmer, and the defense, Atticus, say the last thing that they want to say to the jury before the jury goes and deliberates. So we're going to look at Atticus's closing arguments because those are the ones that we're focused on. In an effort to remind you, in this activity today, you're going to be looking for rhetorical appeals. So ethos, pathos, and logos, which we talked about before we started the trial. I know it was a couple weeks ago. So you're going to want to go back and look at those notes that you have on rhetorical appeals. That way, this will be a little bit easier. As just like a quick review, if you're watching this to save you some time, pathos is the appeal to emotions. When someone uses loaded language or imagery to make you feel some type of way, to get right into your heart. So that's pathos. Ethos is when we use credibility. So when we refer to credible sources or studies, documents like the United States Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, those things show credibility. And logos is the use of facts and statistics. So, 4 out of 5 dentists recommend Colgate toothpaste would be an example of logos. So as you read these closing arguments, you will highlight those examples in blue, pink, or yellow. If you can, try and use these like bright ones on this line, like yellow and blue and pink. When you use the darker colors, it's a lot harder for me to see what you've annotated. And so as you are going through this, you'll see that the sections are broken up by questions. So you'll read these 2 paragraphs and then you'll answer these 2 questions. The part that I want you to focus on normally is underlined. And you want to make sure that you're answering all parts of the question. So it says, explain what rhetorical appeal is being used in the underlined portion of the paragraph and defend your answer. So is this ethos, pathos, or logos, and why? And so you'll know that because you'll have highlighted it blue, pink, or yellow. So that's where your annotation comes in. There are 6 sections of the closing argument. So here is number 2. You are required to annotate the text, so highlight it, and answer these questions that exist within the closing arguments. So if you have questions with this, if you need help, if you want to start it together, Mr. D and I will be live at 10:30. I do want to talk to you about this first one, just to give you kind of a guide. Atticus says, gentlemen, because remember, the people on the jury are 12 white men. Sorry, I thought I had to sneeze. I do have to sneeze, but we'll go from there. Gentlemen, he was saying, I shall be brief, but I would like to use my remaining time with you to remind you that this case is not a difficult one. It requires no minute sifting of complicated facts. Oh, minute, sorry. But it does require you to be sure beyond all reasonable doubt as to the guilt of the defendant. To begin with, the case never should have come to trial. The case is as simple as black and white. The state has not produced one iota of medical evidence to the effect that the crime Tom Robinson is charged with ever took place. It has relied instead upon the testimony of 2 witnesses whose evidence has not only been called into serious question on cross-examination, but has been flatly contradicted by the defendant. The defendant is not guilty, but somebody in the courtroom is. So we have to look at This underlined portion, the state has not produced one iota of medical evidence to the effect that the crime Tom Robinson is charged with ever took place, but instead has relied on the testimony of two witnesses whose evidence has not only been called into serious question on cross-examination. So, as I'm thinking about this, I'm like going through these different rhetorical appeals. Does this make me feel some type of way? Maybe. Um, there's definitely some strong language here, like iota. If you don't know what that means, you should look it up. Um, like called into serious question. So he is using some loaded language. Ethos means credibility. He's definitely calling into question the credibility of the witnesses, but he's not talking about any other credible source to make me believe him. And then we have logos, which is using logic. So for me, I do think that this first example is going to be logic because Tom Robinson can't be guilty if there's no evidence, right? No one called the doctor. We talked about that a lot. No one called the doctor. No one got evidence. No one took pictures. There's no DNA, right? So if I were answering question 1A, I would say this example or this portion is an example of logos because Atticus is referring to the lack of medical evidence and the contradiction of the testimony from the state's witnesses. And then the second one is, why do you think this is important to point out to the jury? Okay, this is important because without medical evidence, there is no proof. It's just a he said, she said. And the she happens to be a white female, and the he happens to be a black male, which makes the case unfair in general because Tom Robinson has no chance, right? He can't win. So that's how I would start to answer these questions. And as you go through, consider those same facts. Consider what you know about the 1930s. Here is a question about that. Evaluate the priorities of society in this time period. How have they changed since the 1930s? Think about what we talked about when we looked at lynch mobs and when we researched, Jim Crow laws. Those kind of things will come in handy now as you examine these closing arguments. Again, Mr. D and I will be with Miss Miller. We'll be live from 10:30 to 11. If you need us, this is part 1 of the assignment. You'll get part 2 next class. But this is what you should be focused on today. And if you need help, just ask or come to live class. I'll see you then.